The wind in the Montana Territory didn't just blow. It howled like a wounded wolf through the jagged limestone cathedrals of the Bitterroot Range, carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine needles and the electric ozone of a gathering mountain storm. To most, it was a warning to bolt the shutters and stoke the hearth, but to Elara Vance, it was the sound of a wild, unyielding freedom that mirrored the beating of her own heart. She stood on the splintered porch of the Emerald Creek Apothecary, her fingers stained with the purple juice of pressed larkspur, watching the horizon bleed into shades of bruised indigo and fiery copper. Elara was a woman forged from mountain granite and prairie wildflowers, a healer who had traded the velvet parlors of Boston for the raw, bleeding edge of the frontier. She was the steady hand of this mining camp, a woman who could extract a lead slug with surgical precision while reciting Keats to calm a dying man. Yet, as she watched the silhouettes of the Douglas firs whip in the gale, she felt a hollow ache, a premonition of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The heavy silence of the evening was shattered by the rhythmic, desperate thud of a horse pushed far past its breaking point. Elara's posture shifted, her spine snapping straight as she reached for the double-barreled shotgun leaning against the doorframe, a habit born of necessity in a gulch where the law was a tin star 3 days' ride away. Out of the swirling red dust emerged a ghost, a tall, broad-shouldered man slumped low in a saddle of darkened leather. His horse, a buckskin stallion flecked with white foam and streaks of drying crimson, stumbled as it reached the hitching post. The man didn't dismount. He collapsed, his spurs jingling with a final, lonely, metallic clatter against the hard-packed earth. Elara didn't hesitate. She dropped the gun and ran, her boots kicking up clouds of silt. As she reached him, the man rolled onto his side, his breath coming in ragged, wet rattles. Even through a mask of trail grime and dried blood, his face was haunting, carved from shadows and hard choices, with eyes the color of a winter lake that seemed to see right through the world. "Easy now," Elara whispered, her voice a low anchor against the rising wind. "You've reached the creek. You're with the healer." The man's hand, calloused and scarred, shot out to grip her forearm with a strength that spoke of a life lived on the trigger. Don't tell the marshal. The gold, it was never in the box." Elara looked down at him, seeing the dark, spreading bloom of a gunshot wound just above his hip. This was Julian Thorne. She didn't need a newspaper to recognize the name. The bounty hunters had been barking it for weeks, the black-hearted rogue, a man accused of murdering a senator's son during a stagecoach heist. But as she looked into those fractured, searching eyes, she didn't see a killer. She saw a man who had been hunted until he had forgotten the taste of water that wasn't tinged with his own blood. For the next week, the world narrowed to the flickering radius of a kerosene lamp in the back room of the apothecary. Elara tended to Julian with a clinical focus that fought a losing battle against a rising tide of empathy. She washed the salt of the trail from his skin, discovering a map of scars that told a story of a boy raised in a war and a man broken by a peace that never came. When the fever gripped him, he didn't mutter threats. He whispered names of a sister long gone and a ranch in the valley that had been burned to ash. Elara stayed through the deepest hours of the night, pressing cool cloths to his brow and singing low folk songs, her heart skipping a beat whenever his hand would blindly find hers in the dark, clutching it like a drowning man reaches for a pier. Emerald Creek was a town built on greed and secrets, a collection of shacks clinging to the mountainside like barnacles. Tensions simmered in the saloon, where the miners whispered about the stranger at the healer's house. When Julian finally woke, the air in the small room felt heavy, charged with the electricity of things left unsaid. He watched her move, his gaze lingering on the way the afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair as she ground herbs. Why?" he asked, his voice a rasping shadow of its former self. "You know there's $5,000 on my head. That could buy you a real hospital in a real city." Elara paused, her pestle hovering over the mortar. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I've seen honest men steal the bread from orphans' mouths in this town, Julian, and I've seen outlaws die to protect a dog. Out here, the law is just a word people use when they want to own something. I don't care what they say you did. I care that you didn't fight me when I cleaned your wound. Julian let out a dry, mirthless clupple. I'm a dead man, Elara. If the hangman doesn't find me, the men I was running from will. I saw things on that stagecoach, things that powerful men want buried in the dirt with me. Then we'll just have to make sure you stay above the dirt, she said firmly. The days that followed were a fragile, stolen peace. As Julian regained his strength, he began to help Elara, his large, steady hands surprisingly adept at labeling tinctures or fixing the sagging porch steps. The local children, usually wary of strangers, began to visit, drawn to the quiet man who could carve intricate wooden birds out of scrap cedar. Elara watched him from the window, her chest tightening with a dangerous longing. She saw the man he was before the world broke him, a man of quiet dignity and hidden gentleness. One evening, under a canopy of stars so bright they looked like spilled diamonds, they sat on the back steps. The only sound was the rushing of the creek and the distant chime of a prospector's pick. Julian reached out, his thumb grazing her knuckles. The touch was soft, but it felt like a lightning strike. I have to leave soon, he murmured, his face a mask of regret. The longer I stay, the more I turn this house into a target. Elara turned to him, her eyes shining with fierce defiance. And if you leave, you're just walking back into the crosshairs. Stay, we can fight this. We can go to the territorial governor. Julian. He moved closer, the scent of cedar and old leather surrounding her. He cupped her jaw, his touch trembling slightly. I've spent 10 years looking for a reason to stop running. I found it here, in this dusty little room with a woman who isn't afraid of the dark. But I love you too much to let you die for my sins. He kissed her then, a slow, desperate collision of two souls who had found home in the middle of a wasteland. It tasted of peppermint and heartache, a vow whispered against the backdrop of a world that wanted them apart. But the frontier is a jealous master. The next morning, the peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves, not the law, but a gang of regulators, hired killers in the pocket of the men Julian had witnessed. They rode into Emerald Creek with torches and repeating rifles, led by a man with a jagged scar across his throat. Thorne, the leader bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Bring out the ledger and we might let the lady live. Julian was already in the kitchen, checking his revolvers. He looked at Elara, a world of pain and resolve in his eyes. They want the proof I took from the stagecoach. It's hidden in the saddlebag of my horse. Elara, if I don't make it— Don't you dare say that, she hissed, grabbing her shotgun. You taught me how to lead a target. Now get to the cellar window. I'll draw their fire from the porch. The battle was a blur of cordite smoke and screaming lead. Elara stood her ground on the porch, the kick of the shotgun bruising her shoulder as she suppressed the men in the street. Julian moved like a shadow, flanking the gang from the side of the house. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and the splintering of wood. It was brutal, quick, and desperate. When the final shot echoed away, the leader of the regulators lay face down in the mud, and Julian stood over him, his shirt soaked in fresh blood, but his eyes clear. The townspeople emerged from their homes, shocked into silence. Julian didn't look at them. He looked only at Elara. He walked to her, his gait heavy, and handed her a small, blood-stained book. This is the truth, Elara, the names of every man who sold out the territory. Take it to the marshal in Helena. Tell him Julian Thorne sent you. We'll take it together, she whispered, catching him as his knees finally buckled. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in hues of gold and violet, the town of Emerald Creek felt different. The fear remained, but there was a new thread of hope woven into the dust. Julian survived the night, and while his name wasn't cleared in a day, the ledger ensured he was no longer a hunted man. "You're a stubborn woman, Elara Vance," Julian said weeks later as they watched a stagecoach pull out of the station, not as fugitives, but as passengers. "And you're a lucky man, Julian Thorne," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. The road to Helena was long, and the shadows of their past still lingered in the canyons, but as the horses pulled them towards the horizon, they didn't look back. The frontier had tried to break them, but instead it had given them the only thing worth having, a love that could survive the storm.